days. They married very young. But this woman has come into his home. She's left her family. And she's come in to be trained to be a wife. But when he reaches 30, he's to leave and cleave, because there are two things. Leave and cleave is a Jewish man at 30, and then full stature is the man of the Jewish man at 30. And that's why Paul says in Ephesians 4, we've been babies long enough. It's time to grow up. Come to full stature. So when you hear or you see full stature in the New Testament and some in the Old when it talks about it, it means the young man has now reached 30 and he has left his home. He's full stature. He's been trained. He's been apprenticed. He is now ready to go on his own. He leaves his family and cleaves to his wife. He is at full stature, and he moves from the inside of the table to the outside of the table, mentoring the younger men, and he becomes a part of the minyan. Isn't that interesting? Now, what I just told you is in the Mishnah, but it's not in the Scripture. But when did Jesus start his ministry? 30 years of age. He came to full stature, and even though what I just told you is not a law and not given to us in the Scripture, because it's in the Mishnah and it was the traditions, Jesus followed the traditions of the Jewish culture, because those traditions were given by the Creator, and they're in the software. Isn't that wonderful? Until he was 30 years of age, what was he known as? The carpenter's son. He had a trade. Had he taken that trade, he would have been successful, because as the oldest child, he would have inherited the business. But he chose to be about his father's business at 12. Remember when they went into Jerusalem and they were a day's journey away and they realized Jesus wasn't in the group? And so they went back, and here he was. He was in the temple, and he was astounding the Pharisees with his knowledge and his wisdom of godly things. Now, I always wondered about this. It says in the Scripture he was 12, but that was basically his bar mitzvah. In the Jewish culture, you celebrate your first birthday 3 months after you're born. The Jewish culture considers that the point of conception starts your first birthday. So he was 12 in the temple because of 1611. When they translated, they put it together, and by Western culture he was 12 years of age, but by Jewish culture he was 13. Isn't that interesting? Just little nuggets of truth in there that make looking at the Scriptures fun. And it follows its way all the way through. It's consistent. So Jesus still, after his bar mitzvah, knowing his purpose in life, all of those years, from 13 to 30, he knew his purpose, but he stayed in submission to the structure. And that's what I want us to look at. So from 30 to death, independence is primary, because we live in the age of decision. If I'm from birth to 13, I'm dependent, because I can't make decisions. I have to live with the decisions of my caregivers. And so God's intention was for from birth to 13 years of age, we are to be nurtured, we are to be protected, we are to grow, we are to mature to the age of about 8.5 to 9 years of age, and that's when the chemicals kick in the brain and we start thinking differently. But at 13, they have manifest themselves so that those chemicals are usable, and we're in the age of decision. So here I am, birth to 13, vulnerable to my caregivers. And now we go to the next chart. Early wounds in childhood. And here's the foundation of what we're dealing with today. Satan says, aha, if that's the way God intended a child to be, nurtured, loved, validated, trained, taught, I am going to screw that up so bad. And that's why in Matthew 18, Jesus said, woe be unto he who would wound a child better a millstone tied around the neck of the perpetrator and drowned in the deepest part of the sea than to wound a child. In other words, what Jesus is literally saying in red letters in Matthew is that the damnation of a perpetrator would be less had that person been drowned before he touched the child or she touched the child. Less would be their damnation. Because now that they've wounded a child, the perpetrator's damnation is going to be beyond your wildest imagination. They'd have been better off dead on the fantasy. That's how important a child is. That's pretty important, wouldn't you say? And so Satan says, aha, I'm going to wound the child. There are 5 things that will wound a child to a point that the child will lock up developmentally for the rest of its life. We call it arrested development. Mental health calls it fixation. The 5 things are rejection, incest, molestation, emotional, or physical abuse. And I've been studying the brain for about 7 years, and what we found is there is a neurobiological lockup when one of these things happens in the brain. And I deal with people who have had all 5 things happen. And they are so locked down, it's unbelievable. And as we started researching this, I realized, because this is my recovery, I needed to know this stuff. I spent $20,000, $30,000 on therapy, and nobody could tell me anything about this. It was not known back in the days I was seeking for therapy. But what happened was the things that happened to me. The sexual abuse at 3.5 years of age by the pastor's daughter. The rape at 8.5 to 9. I don't have a timeline. It was right in there, 8.5 to 9, by an older man. My development was locked up, and what happens is if I am wounded as a child, my development locks up, and I can be victimized for the rest of my life. I'm like a child the rest of my life. I can be victimized over and over and over and over again. Because the greater the crisis in my life, the more I will regress back before puberty to the lockup in my brain. And I'm powerless. See, that's the thing we have to look at. If I'm arrested in development, then I develop, and here's another sad piece of this puzzle, is my core never grows up. Without help, without understanding of what we're dealing with today, your core emotions will never mature. So what do? We end up with developmental issues under 8.5 to 9 years of age, but we don't want anybody to think that something's wrong with us, so we develop what's called a pseudo-personality. And that personality, I develop it so greatly that I will meet you, and within 20 minutes of meeting you, I can judge in my own mind what you expect of me so you won't reject me. And then I mold my personality to keep from being rejected by you. So I never develop a true self. I only develop and scramble to keep from being rejected, and I become very chameleonic because I can be one thing to you at that table, I can be another thing to you and another thing to you, and I just, you know, if I'm sitting with you, I can talk to you about certain things, and this is who I am, and I can move around, but I change my personality to meet your needs. In other words, I sacrifice myself, and I'm never a true person. I never develop a true characteristics of character and even language. Now, what's interesting with this is we work in the domestic violence field, and we will deal with women who can outside be wonderful at work, but at home a stress or a crisis will cause her to lose the ability of language. And her husband will yell at her and say, "What's wrong with you? Talk to me." And she can't talk because her wounds were before she developed language. And so the crisis, the sound of the voice, whatever's happening, she regresses back before language and has no ability to communicate. Give her 72 hours and she can come back after she de-escalates and she can talk a little bit about it, but never understands what she's dealing with. In domestic violence, it's called the Jekyll-Hyde personality. But in James 1, it's called the double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. Now, let me take you down a path here. And hopefully, maybe if we run over a little bit, they can slip in another tape. If I have two personalities, and see, that's what Satan tries to develop within us, is the instability of two personalities. If I have two personalities, and I have a pseudo that I live with most of the time, do you realize that we can get a pseudo-Christian experience for a pseudo-personality, but we've never been saved to the core? And then Timothy tells us we have an appearance of godliness, but no power. And Matthew 7 says that many will say, but Lord, Lord, I did these miracles in your name. And he says, depart from me, you workers of iniquity. I never knew you. And the pseudo-Christian experience for a pseudo-personality salves us. But we struggle. And one of the biggest things we struggle with is the authority of God. Our pseudo-personality can speak things, but our core is resistant to God's authority. The authority of a boss, the authority in a marriage, the authority in even a teacher in Sunday school class. We hate authority. So we develop, and this is one of the things I talk about with preachers who leave major denominations and start their own church. One of the key things that they can't deal with is the authority and living under that authority and that umbrella of a denomination. So they start their own church, and then they surround themselves with people like themselves. And boy, doesn't that create chaos. See, and so we've got, and where I want to go with this is building a team. If I'm arrested in development, I'm wounded in childhood, I feel like I'm flawed, defective, dirty, damaged, and different, then I have to go overboard in my pseudo, and I become a control freak. Why do I become a control freak? Because if I can't control my own life, I have to control everything around me. Circumstances, situations, and other people. And that's the core, as I talked about earlier, of working in a company. And then in that company, I surround myself and create loyalties within that company, and it creates division. And then I see myself as head of something, and I'm really not head of anything. I'm just doing this for my own gratification. To overreact because I feel like I'm flawed and defective and things are not going in well in my own life and my own life's out of control. So then I bring it to work, I bring it to church, and I try to control everything at work and everything at church. So my personal life bleeds in to the work life and into my spiritual life and produces chaos. And then Satan sits back and laughs because people that God have called to do things. And we all have something that God, in God's file folder for our lives, there's something there that's productive He's called us to do. And Satan sits back and laughs at the chaos that's created by the lack of maturity in our lives. And that's why it says back in I think it's Jeremiah 4:22, if you want to look it up, it says, my people are dull, retarded children bent to do wrong with no knowledge to do right. It says back in Isaiah 28, God told the old prophet, He said, my people are like babies on the breast. It's time that they grow up and get wisdom, and the beginning of wisdom, and I'm going to take you to the original Hebrew because it repeats it more than the translations do. The beginning of wisdom is the knowledge of God, precept upon precept upon precept upon precept, line upon line upon line upon line, here a little, there a little. Do you realize when that was written, that is today's computer language? That's how we learn. That's how a computer learns. That's how you program a computer. So God's saying through the Old Testament, read Isaiah, the 3rd chapter, the first 12 verses. Interesting. God says, I'm going to take away the mature people. I'm going to take away the man of honor, the man of valor, the military man, the thinker, the seer. I'm going to take it away, and then you're going to be ruled